people sharing paranormal experiences. When she opened the closet door, the scratching stopped. But the whisper came from behind her. If you're ready for a story that will crawl under your skin and stay there, stick around. The first account. It started with the kind of stillness that doesn't feel natural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Inside a lonely diner off a forgotten stretch of highway in Nevada, a handful of strangers sat in uncomfortable silence. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of grease from the kitchen. A single fluorescent light above their booth flickered rhythmically, casting their faces in erratic shadows that made everyone look a little more hollow, a little less human. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of her coffee mug as she spoke, her voice so quiet it barely carried over the hum of the freezer in the back. At first, it was just knocking. Harmless, right? She gave a short, humorless laugh. My brother said he thought it was rats, but he was wrong. God, he was so wrong. She paused, staring into the dark swirl of coffee, as if the answers were buried at the bottom of the cup. Her voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone to lean in. The knocking started in the walls, soft at first. Then it got louder. At night it would move, first from the walls, then the ceiling, then under his bed. He'd bang back sometimes, just to feel like he wasn't losing his mind. But one night, he told me it banged back, like it was answering him, like it understood him. She took a shaky breath, her nails tapping nervously against the ceramic mug. I told him to stay with me that night, but he just laughed it off. "It's nothing," he said, "just my imagination." But the next day he looked worse, pale, jumpy. He wouldn't even go into his own room without turning every light on first. Then, 2 weeks later, he told me he wasn't sleeping, said the knocking had gotten closer. He said he could feel it now, like something was crawling inside the walls, pushing against the plaster, trying to get out. Sarah's hands began to tremble. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to continue. The night he disappeared, he called me. I'll never forget the way he sounded. Terrified. He said, "Sarah, it's not in the walls anymore. It's here. It's right under my bed." Her voice cracked, and she paused to steady herself, but her eyes darted toward the diner window, scanning the pitch-black highway outside. I told him to leave the house, to run. But then, the line went dead. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly as she struggled to speak. When I got there, his room was wrong. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it hurts. I called his name, but nothing answered. The only thing I found was his phone, lying face up on the floor. The screen was still lit, still recording. I thought maybe it had accidentally recorded him running out, but when I played it back, her voice faltered, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. Everyone waited, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were leaning in closer. The last thing on the recording was him whispering, "It's looking at me." Then there was this sound, like nails dragging across wood. And after that, nothing. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, but Sarah wasn't finished. I thought it was over after that. I thought whatever took him was gone. But 2 nights later, I heard it. She paused, her breath hitching. The knocking. It came from my closet. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then it got louder and louder, until it sounded like something was pounding, desperate to get out. I opened the door and she stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide and glistening with fear. There was nothing there, she finally whispered, but I swear I felt something brush past me. Something cold and damp, like it had been waiting for me to open that door. The group sat frozen, the diner's once familiar sounds, the clinking of dishes, the distant hum of the freezer, now felt alien, intrusive, like they didn't belong. Sarah's voice dropped even lower, forcing them to strain to hear her next words. It didn't stop after that. The knocking follows me, no matter where I go. Hotels, friends' houses, even here. She glanced at the walls of the diner as though expecting them to respond. Sometimes it's in the walls, sometimes it's under the bed, and sometimes it's right behind me. Her words hung in the air like a noose, tightening around everyone's necks. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin glass windows of the diner. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and the sound of a chair scraping against the floor felt deafening in the oppressive quiet. "I don't know what it is," Sarah said finally, her voice barely a whisper now. "But I know it won't stop. Whatever took my brother, it's not done. It's just waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. And when it does..." She trailed off, shaking her head. Her hand darted out suddenly to grab her phone as it buzzed against the table, making everyone jump. She stared at the screen for a long moment before placing it face down, her face pale and unreadable. The others watched her silently, the weight of her story pressing down on them like a physical force. No one said a word, but their unease was palpable. It spread through the room like a dark, creeping fog, wrapping itself around their throats and squeezing. And somewhere, far off in the distance, a faint sound echoed, a single sharp knock. The diner's fluorescent light flickered again, and this time, it didn't come back on. The second story. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window as if something might be lurking just beyond the diner's thin panes of glass. The glow of the flickering fluorescent light above made his face look gaunt, his cheekbones casting sharp shadows, giving him an almost skeletal appearance. He hadn't touched his coffee or the plate of greasy eggs in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, as though dredging up the memory was physically painful. "My story starts with a cabin," he said, his eyes fixed on the table as he spoke. "It was my parents' place, this little retreat in the woods they'd escape to on weekends. When they passed, they left it to me. I never really used it. Wasn't much of an outdoorsy guy. But last winter, I figured I'd go there to clear my head, maybe get some peace and quiet. Turns out, I got anything but." He paused, running a hand over his face. "The first couple of days were fine, peaceful even. But then one night, I noticed something weird." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the memory itself demanded discretion. "It was the mirrors," he said, his tone sharp with dread. "Every single one of them felt wrong. At first I thought I was just tired. The reflections looked fine, at least they did when I glanced at them quickly. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed things that shouldn't have been there." He paused, his fingers drumming anxiously against the table. "One night, I caught a shadow moving in the mirror behind me. I spun around expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing there. It didn't make sense. The shadow had been clear, distinct, like a person standing just behind my shoulder. But when I turned, the room was empty. I laughed it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, and again, always in the mirrors." Mike's voice grew unsteady, the tremor in his words betraying his mounting fear. "One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like I was being watched. My bedroom had this big old mirror on the wall across from the bed, and when I looked into it, I saw something wrong. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room, barely visible. But then it started to move. It slid along the edge of the reflection, too quick to make out any details. And the worst part, when I turned to look at the corner of the room directly, there was nothing there. But in the mirror, it was closer." He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I covered the mirror that night, used a blanket, taped it down. I thought maybe if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. But the next morning when I woke up, the blanket was on the floor, and the mirror was uncovered. I didn't even hear it fall. And the reflection, it wasn't my room anymore. It was dark like a void, and there were these shapes. Shadows moving in and out of view like they were searching for something or someone." Mike's breathing quickened as he continued. "That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone in that cabin. Whatever was in the mirrors, it was real. And it wasn't just watching me, it was trying to reach me." He hesitated, his gaze darting to the window again, as though expecting to see the shadows from his story, lingering just outside. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the more I tried, the worse it got. The shadows started showing up in the windows, in the reflections of the kitchen appliances, even in the water when I ran the tap. His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the others to lean in to hear him. The last night I spent in that cabin, I smashed every mirror I could find, took a hammer to them, one by one, until there wasn't a single piece of glass left intact. For a moment I thought I'd won, but then the whispers started. Mike shuddered, his hands trembling as he reached for his coffee, though he didn't drink it. It was faint at first, like someone whispering my name from another room. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling me. I locked myself in the bedroom, barricaded the door with furniture, but the whispers didn't stop. They got louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were coming from inside my own head. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, he trailed off, his voice breaking. When I woke up, the furniture was back in place. The door was wide open, and on the wall where the mirror used to be, there was a smear, black and oily, like something had crawled out of the glass and into the room. I ran. I didn't even pack my things. I just grabbed my keys and drove as fast as I could, swerving around trees and praying I wouldn't see anything in the rearview mirror. Mike finally looked up, his eyes haunted, his face pale. I've never gone back. I sold the cabin to some developer, told them they could do whatever they wanted with it. But sometimes, he paused, his voice trembling, sometimes I'll catch something out of the corner of my eye, in a window or a reflection on my phone screen just for a second, and when I turn to look, there's nothing there. But I know it's still watching me, waiting. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unease. The sound of a coffee cup clinking against a saucer startled everyone, the noise too sharp in the oppressive silence. Mike stared at his untouched coffee, his hand twitching slightly. I don't know what it wants, he said quietly, but I know this. Whatever it is, it's patient, and one day, it's going to find a way back. As he finished speaking, a faint noise echoed through the diner, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the window, but there was nothing there, only darkness, stretching endlessly into the night. The third witness, Alex, sat at the counter, barely breathing. The tension in the diner had thickened, like the walls were closing in around them. He was the cook, a regular fixture of this roadside diner, but tonight he looked like a stranger. Someone dragged into the same dark current that had swallowed Sarah and Mike. He hadn't spoken much, not until now. His hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter, and the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin pale and waxy under the flickering light. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice cracked, strained and dry, as if it hadn't been used in days. "You ever hear your name, but no one's there?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the counter as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze. His words sent a ripple through the room. The question was simple, even ordinary, but there was something about the way he said it, so hollow, so broken, that made everyone uneasy. He continued without waiting for an answer. "I used to hear it all the time. At first I thought it was my neighbors. You know how sound carries in those old apartments? But it was always late at night, always faint, like someone calling me from far away. Sometimes it sounded like my mom's voice, or a friend's. Sometimes it didn't sound like anyone I knew at all. And every time I'd go to the window or to the door thinking someone was there. But there never was." Alex's hand twitched as he reached for the rag on the counter, wringing it nervously in his hands. "At first it didn't bother me. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But then, one night, it was different. I was walking home from work. It was late, past midnight, and the streets were empty. Quiet, too quiet. No cars, no dogs barking, not even the sound of my own footsteps. And then I heard it, my name, clear as day. It came from somewhere behind me." His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the others to strain to hear him. I stopped, turned around. There was nothing there, just the empty street stretching back into the dark. But the way it said my name, he shivered, clutching the rag tighter. It wasn't right. It wasn't like a person calling out to get your attention. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the sound of my name, like it wasn't calling me, it was claiming me. He paused, his eyes darting to the window. I should have kept walking, I should have ignored it. But instead, I did something stupid. I answered. I don't know why. I don't even remember making the decision, it just came out. "Who's there?" I said. And for a second there was nothing, just silence. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Alex. Alex's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I got to my apartment and locked the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting to hear it again. But all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I thought maybe I was safe, that whatever it was had stayed outside. He paused, his hand trembling as he wiped his face with the rag. But then I heard it, inside, faint at first, like it was coming from the other end of the apartment. It said my name again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. I froze. It didn't make sense. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I'd locked the door, bolted the windows. But the voice didn't care about doors or windows. It was here, with me. Alex's voice grew more strained, each word dragging itself out of his throat like it didn't want to be spoken. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started checking every room. The bathroom, the closet under the bed, nothing. But the voice kept coming, always just out of reach. And then, it was behind me, right behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was there. I could feel it. The air got colder, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. And then it spoke again. But this time it didn't say my name, it said, "Let me in." The others sat frozen, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on Alex as he continued. I don't remember what happened after that. I think I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor. The knife was gone and the apartment was dead silent. I wanted to believe it was over, that it had left, but deep down I knew better. It wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. It followed me here, you know. I can feel it. I hear it sometimes, late at night, when I'm closing up the diner. My name, faint and far away, like it's trying to remind me that it's still there. And sometimes, his voice broke, and he swallowed hard before continuing. Sometimes I hear it when I'm not alone, when there are other people around, like it's trying to see if anyone else can hear it too. But no one ever does. Just me. Alex's eyes darted to the far corner of the diner, his face pale and haunted. I don't know what it wants. I don't even know what it is. But I know this. It doesn't stop. It doesn't give up. And one day, when I finally answer it again, it's going to take me. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of his words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a high-pitched whine that sounded almost like a voice, almost like a name. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows of the diner, there was a faint sound. A whisper. The climax. The diner felt suffocating, the tension within its walls almost unbearable. The stories had woven an invisible web around the small group, each thread tightening until it was impossible to ignore the heavy weight of something unseen pressing down on them. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the wind outside now felt deliberate, purposeful, like the building itself had begun to breathe with some dark life. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the uneasy silence and making everyone jump. She hesitated before reaching for it, her trembling, her face drained of color as her eyes locked on the screen. It was a text message, simple but impossible. The sender was her brother, the brother who had vanished 5 years ago without a trace. Her breath hitched audibly as her lips silently formed the words written in bold letters across the screen. Why didn't you help me? For a moment, she was frozen, her mind caught between disbelief and terror. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, but their presence felt distant, irrelevant. The phone buzzed again, another message. This time the words were jagged, disjointed, as if typed in a rush. "It's not done. I see you now." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, the clatter echoing too loudly in the oppressive quiet of the diner. Her eyes darted to the window, her pupils wide and unblinking. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Or it's something pretending to be him." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease rippling through the group. The wind outside picked up, rattling the thin glass of the diner's windows. It howled in uneven bursts, like a mournful wail from some vast, unseen mouth. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "It's just a coincidence," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Maybe someone hacked his old number, or something." "No," Sarah said firmly, shaking her head. Her voice was louder now, edged with desperation. "You don't understand. He's been gone for 5 years. And this isn't the first time." Her gaze was wild, darting from one face to the next. "I've been getting these messages for weeks, from his number. At first I thought it was someone's idea of a sick joke, but now I know it's not." Before anyone could respond, a sharp noise cut through the room, a single deliberate knock. It came from the window nearest their booth, startling them all into silence. The knock was followed by another, louder this time, as though demanding their attention. Slowly, almost unwillingly, they turned toward the sound. The glass was fogged over from the cold outside, but there was something there. A shape, vague and indistinct, but undeniably human. It stood perfectly still, pressed close against the glass, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though observing them. For a moment no one moved, their minds struggling to process the sight. Then the figure shifted, dragging a hand slowly across the glass. The screeching sound it made was like nails on a chalkboard, setting everyone's teeth on edge. Sarah's phone buzzed again, breaking the spell. She snatched it up with trembling hands, her breath coming in short gasps. The new message read, "It's here. Don't let it in." She looked up at the others, her face pale and drawn. "We can't open the door," she said, her voice shaking. "No matter what happens, we can't let it in." As if in response, the knocking intensified. It was no longer coming from just the window. Now it seemed to echo from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The sound was relentless, frantic, like a dozen pairs of fists pounding desperately to be let inside. The lights flickered above them, plunging the room into momentary darkness before sputtering weakly back to life. Alex backed away from the counter, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not real. It's not real." But the panic in his eyes said otherwise. The figure at the window pressed closer, its outline growing more defined. The fog began to clear, revealing a face, or what should have been a face. Its features were blurred, as though smeared like wet paint, and its eyes were black voids, empty and endless. When it opened its mouth, no sound came out, but the air in the diner seemed to grow heavier, colder, as though the thing outside was sucking the warmth and life from the room. The knocking reached a fever pitch, a deafening cacophony that drowned out even their own thoughts. Mike clutched at his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as he screamed, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" But the sound only grew louder, more insistent. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking ceased. The silence that followed was worse. It was suffocating, unnatural, like the world itself had paused to hold its breath. No one dared move. Even the faint hum of the diner's appliances seemed muted, as though the building had been plunged into some other reality where normal rules didn't apply. Sarah's phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. The message was short, final. Too late. The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. Someone screamed, a high, piercing sound that was abruptly cut off. Then came the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a wet, guttural noise that sent shivers down their spines. When the lights flickered back on, Sarah was gone. Her chair lay overturned, her phone abandoned on the floor, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. The others stared at the empty space where she had been, their faces pale with horror. The pounding started again, louder than ever, but this time it wasn't just on the walls or the windows. It was coming from beneath the floor, the ceiling, from everywhere at once. Mike stumbled backward, his face twisted in terror. "We're next," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound. "It's coming for us." And then, for the first time, the thing spoke. Its voice was deep and guttural, like the grinding of stone against stone. "Let me in." The words echoed through the diner, reverberating in their bones, shaking the very air around them. The lights went out again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The final revelation. The darkness inside the diner was complete, thick and oppressive, swallowing everything in its grasp. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt alive, tangible, pressing against their skin like damp hands grasping their necks. The world beyond the diner's thin walls no longer seemed to exist. It was as if they had been cast into a void, trapped in a black hole of terror where the rules of reality no longer applied. The faint sound of someone breathing, quick and shallow, was the only indication that anyone else was still alive in the choking darkness. Then, the whispers began. They slithered through the air like venomous snakes, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from everywhere, above, below, behind. Voices that shouldn't have been there, voices that didn't belong. Some sounded distant, distorted, like an old recording played too slowly. Others were so close they brushed against their ears, hot and wet, as though whoever or whatever was speaking was standing right beside them. "Why didn't you help me?" one voice hissed, and Sarah's name rang out faintly, carried on the tail of the sentence. "Let me in." The words were dragged out, heavy with malice, each syllable filled with a hunger that was almost palpable. Someone screamed, a piercing, guttural sound that was abruptly swallowed by the darkness. It wasn't clear who it was. Their voices were indistinguishable now, lost in the rising tide of panic. The air grew colder, sharp and biting, as if the shadows themselves were leeching the warmth from their bodies. Then the lights flickered back on. The diner was bathed in harsh, sterile fluorescence again, but the scene that greeted them was worse than the darkness. The walls, once blank and faded from years of neglect, were now covered in smeared handprints. Some were small, like those of a child, while others were enormous, grotesque, their elongated fingers ending in jagged claws that looked like they could tear through flesh. The handprints weren't red like blood. They were black, shiny and wet, like oil. They dripped onto the linoleum floor, forming inky puddles that seemed to spread outward, consuming the light around them. Mike was gone. His chair was overturned, his coffee spilled and pooling on the counter, but there was no sign of him. No sound of struggle, no scream, just the eerie void where he had been moments before. Alex stared at the spot, his face pale and slack, his lips trembling as he tried to form words that wouldn't come. Where is he? He finally managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's phone buzzed again, vibrating on the floor where it had been abandoned. The sound seemed deafening in the unnatural silence that followed. Alex bent down, his hands shaking violently as he picked it up. The screen glowed faintly, casting his face in an unnatural light. The new message was short, but it made his stomach drop. "It's your turn." Before he could react, the knocking returned. It was louder now, more urgent, pounding from every surface. The windows, the doors, the walls, even the ceiling above them. The sound was maddening, relentless, like an army of fists battering against the diner in an attempt to get inside. But it wasn't just knocking anymore. It was accompanied by a low, guttural growl, a sound that no human throat could produce. Alex backed away from the counter, clutching the phone like a lifeline. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. The windows were opaque with black handprints, the doors rattling on their hinges as though they might fly open at any moment. The growling grew louder, deeper, until it seemed to vibrate through their bones. "Do you hear it?" Alex whispered, his voice cracking as he turned to the others, only to find he was alone. Sarah was gone. Her phone was still in his hand, the screen now dark, but she was nowhere to be seen. The diner felt impossibly large now, the shadows stretching out in every direction, swallowing the light from the flickering bulbs above. Alex's heart raced as he stumbled toward the door, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape. But no matter how far he moved, the door seemed to grow further and further away, like the diner itself was alive, pulling him deeper into its maw. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing inside his head. They overlapped, blending into a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language he couldn't understand. But then, one voice cut through the others, a deep, guttural snarl that spoke directly to him. "You can't run." The words froze him in place. The air around him grew heavier, suffocating, and he felt something cold brush against the back of his neck. Slowly, against every instinct in his body, he turned around. The thing standing before him wasn't human. It had the vague outline of a person, but its body was made of shadow, constantly shifting and writhing like a mass of living darkness. Its face was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck in the light around it. Where its eyes should have been, there were only 2 pinpricks of white, burning like distant stars. It raised a hand, long and spindly, its fingers ending in impossibly sharp claws. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing tilted its head, studying him with an unnerving curiosity before it spoke again. "You let us in." The lights flickered one last time, plunging the room back into darkness. When the sun rose the next morning, the diner was empty. The doors were locked, the windows dark. The police arrived hours later, responding to reports of strange noises in the area, but they found no sign of Sarah, Mike, or Alex. Inside, the only evidence of their presence was Sarah's shattered phone lying on the floor and a single message scrawled on the counter in what appeared to be black, oily handprints. "We're here now." If you're still here, maybe you're brave enough to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. But be careful the next time you hear your name in the dark, because something might be calling you too.